54th plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called. The General Assembly will resume its consideration of Agenda Item 110, entitled Report of the Secretary General on the Work of the Organization. In connection with this item, the Assembly has before it the report of the Secretary General on the work of the organization, issued as document A/78/1. Before proceeding further, as stated in my 2024, the Secretary General will make a statement to brief on his priorities for 2024, after which the formal meeting will be suspended for an informal meeting for interventions from the membership. Thereafter, the formal meeting will resume for delegations to deliver statements under Agenda Item 110. After his departure, the Secretary General's seat at the podium may be occupied by his representative. If I hear no objection, we shall proceed accordingly. It is so decided. I now give the floor to the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency António Guterres, to brief the Assembly on his priorities for 2024.
Mr. President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by extending my very best wishes for 2024. I wish health and happiness for you and your families, and peace for our world. Our organization was founded on the pursuit of peace. Peace is our raison d'être. Yet, as I scan the landscape of today's world, the one thing missing most dramatically is peace. And by that I mean peace in all its dimensions. As conflicts rage and geopolitical divisions grow, peace in our world is threatened. As polarization deepens and human rights are trampled, peace within communities is undermined. As inequalities explode, peace with justice is shattered. And as we continue our addiction to fossil fuels, we make a mockery of any notion of peace with nature. Around the globe and across the range of issues, peace is the missing piece. People want peace and security. People want peace and dignity. And frankly, people want peace and quiet. There is so much anger and hate and noise in our world today. Every day, and at every turn, it seems, it's war. Terrible conflicts that are killing and maiming civilians in record numbers. Wars of words, turf wars, culture wars. So many peddling the perverse myth that says you multiply support by dividing people. And this is especially troubling in a year when half of humanity will go to the polls. Meanwhile, more and more families are falling behind, more and more countries are drowning in debt, more and more people are losing trust in institutions and faith in the political process. Peace is the way out of this interlinked crisis. Peace is more than a noble vision. Peace is a rallying cry. It is a call to action. And our obligation is to act together for peace in all its dimensions. Excellencies, despite the turbulence of our times, there are reasons for hope. At the SDG Summit, world leaders endorsed an SDG stimulus and the need for far-reaching reforms of international financial architecture. Countries also reached agreement last year on the High Seas Treaty to protect precious marine biodiversity from pollution and overfishing. We are making some headway on climate justice. The Loss and Damage Fund, provided it is well funded, will help vulnerable countries recover from the impacts of extreme weather. And the Security Council agreed to our years-long call to back peace enforcement and counter-terrorism operations led by regional partners, notably the African Union, with mandates from the Council and supported by assessed contributions. And the new high-level advisory body on artificial intelligence launched a global conversation on how this all-pervading technology can benefit us all. Looking ahead, at the Summit of the Future in September, we have a chance to shape multilateralism for years to come. And indeed, our world badly needs reform of the Security Council, reform of the international financial system, the meaningful engagement of youth in decision-making, a global digital compact to maximize the benefits of new technologies and minimize the risks, an emergency platform to improve the international response to complex global shocks. And I see a truly dynamic effort to build a more effective, inclusive, and renewed multilateralism turned to the 21st century and our increasingly multipolar world. And you are at the heart of this essential effort, and peace is at the heart of all we do. Excellencies, for millions of people caught up in conflict around the world, life is a deadly, daily, hungry hell. Record numbers are fleeing their homes in search of safety, and they are crying out for peace, and we must hear them and act. In the immediate term, we must continue to push for peace across the globe. The situation in Gaza is a festering wound on our collective conscience that threatens the entire region. Nothing justifies the horrific terror attacks launched by Hamas against Israel on 7 October, nor is there any justification for the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. Yet, Israeli military operations have resulted in destruction and death in Gaza at a scale and speed without parallel since I became Secretary General. And I'm especially alarmed by reports that the Israeli military intends to focus next on Rafah, where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been squeezed in a desperate search for safety. Such an action would exponentially increase what is already a humanitarian nightmare with untold regional consequences. It's time for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. And this must rapidly lead to irreversible actions towards a two-state solution based on nations' resolutions, international law, and previous agreements. In Ukraine, I repeat my call for a just and sustainable peace in line with UN Charter and international law for Ukraine, for Russia, and for the world. In a swath of countries across the Sahel, terrorism is spiking and civilians are paying a terrible price. We will not relent in supporting the people of the Sahel in these troubling times. Collective action is essential in the Horn of Africa to consolidate the hard-won gains against Al-Shabaab and to preserve the fundamental principle of territorial integrity, avoiding new crises. The fighting must stop in Sudan before it destroys even more lives and spreads. And in Libya, while a ceasefire holds, the Libyan people deserve sustained peace and stability, starting with a commitment to free and fair elections. In Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, I call on all armed groups to lay down their weapons, and I urge regional leaders to prioritize dialogue over conflict. In Yemen, I appeal to all parties to focus on the path to peace and also to de-escalate tensions in the Red Sea based on the principle of freedom of navigation. In Myanmar, we need sustained international and regional attention to help urgently forge a path towards a democratic transition and return to civilian rule. And in Haiti, lawlessness is surging and millions face acute food insecurity. the multinational security support mission must be deployed without delay, and I hope all obstacles will be removed. But I also urge member states to provide the necessary financial support. And in the Western Balkans, some leaders continue to stoke tensions and NATO nationalistic rhetoric. I urge action for reconciliation, stability, and economic prosperity across the region. Excellencies, if countries fulfill their obligations under the Charter, every person's right to a life of peace and dignity would be guaranteed. But governments are ignoring and undermining the very tenets of multilateralism with zero accountability. The United Nations Security Council, the primary platform for questions of global peace, is deadlocked by geopolitical fissures. This is not the first time the Council has been divided, but it is the worst. Today's dysfunction is deeper and more dangerous. During the Cold War, well-established mechanisms helped manage superpower relations. In today's multipolar world, such mechanisms are missing. And so our world is entering in an age of chaos. And we are seeing the result, a dangerous, unpredictable free-for-all with total impunity. On the other way, after decades of nuclear disarmament, states are competing to make their nuclear arsenals faster, stealthier, and more accurate. New potential domains of conflict and weapons of war are being developed without guardrails, creating new ways to kill each other and for humanity to annihilate itself. As conflicts proliferate, global humanitarian needs are at an all-time high, but funding is not keeping pace. Humanitarian workers are saving lives and easing suffering around the world, and I pay tribute to their heroic efforts and to those aid workers who have paid the ultimate price, most recently and tragically in Gaza. Excellencies, we need to strengthen and renew global peace and security frameworks to deal with the complexities of today's multipolar world. And that is the rationale of our new agenda for peace. First and foremost, the United Nations Security Council must be able to take decisions and implement them. And it must become more representative. It is totally unacceptable that the African continent is still waiting for a permanent seat. And the Council's working message must also be updated so that it can make progress even when members are sharply divided. The new agenda for peace addresses strategic risks through a recommitment to eliminating nuclear weapons and stepped-up efforts to prevent conflict. It proposes measures to mitigate the impact of geopolitical competition on people and prevent the fragmentation of global trade rules, supply chains, currencies, and the internet. It presents a view of prevention that addresses violence in all its forms and at all levels. It recognizes the links between sustainable development, climate action, and peace. And it calls for the transformation of gendered power dynamics, the meaningful inclusion of women and young people in all peace processes, and respect for all human rights, civil, political, economic, social, and cultural. It underscores the need for peacekeeping missions with realistic mandates and well-defined transition and exit strategies. And it urges the development of norms of frameworks to regulate the use of new technologies, including artificial intelligence in the military domain. Excellences, nous avons également besoin de paix au sein même des communautés. Partout dans le monde, nous voyons des populations divisées par la montée des discours de haine, de la discrimination, de l'extrémisme et des atteintes aux droits humains. L'antisémitisme, le sectarisme anti-musulman, la persécution de minorités chrétiennes et l'idéologie suprémaciste blanche sont en hausse. L'autoritarisme se répand, l'espace civique rétrécit, les médias sont attaqués. La discrimination à l'égard des femmes et des filles et la violence sexuelle et sexiste constituent les atteintes aux droits humains les plus répandues dans le monde. Et je vois deux raisons fondamentales à cette situation généralisée. Premièrement, la vitesse et la portée de la désinformation et de la haine ont augmenté de façon exponentielle à l'ère numérique. La recherche du profit a aidé les extrémistes à semer la division. Deuxièmement, les inégalités, réelles ou ressenties, les privations économiques ainsi que les changements sociaux et économiques rapides nourrissent les peurs des populations. Et bien que le niveau de vie global dans le monde soit plus élevé que jamais, 6 personnes sur 7 déclarent se sentir inquiètes et craindre pour leur avenir. L'Organisation des Nations Unies soutient les efforts visant à décupler les investissements en faveur de la cohésion sociale et prioriser la sécurité de chaque personne. C'est pour cela que nous appelons au renouvellement du contrat social fondé sur la confiance, la justice et l'inclusion et ancré dans les droits humains. Et nous faisons progresser mon appel à l'action en faveur des droits humains. Nous œuvrons pour une pleine participation des femmes sur un pied d'égalité et leur leadership à tous les secteurs de la société, et ce, de toute urgence. Et nous faisons pression sur les entreprises technologiques afin qu'elles assument leurs responsabilités en cessant d'amplifier et de tirer profit de la propagation d'une désinformation toxique et d'autres contenus nuisibles. Notre prochain code de conduite pour l'intégrité de l'information, qui sera publié avant le sommet de l'avenir, aidera les décideurs à faire de l'espace numérique un endroit inclusif et plus sûr pour tous, tout en défendant le droit à la liberté d'expression. Tous les dirigeants ont la responsabilité de veiller à ce que les populations se sentent incluses et représentées, à ce que la diversité soit pleinement reconnue comme une force et à ce que chacune communauté se sente valorisée et occupe une place à part entière dans la société. Excellencies, beyond tensions in the world and within communities, we need peace with justice. Inequalities and injustice are fuel for a world at war with itself, and conflicts are stoking further inequalities and injustice. Take the tale of two canals. Trade via the Suez Canal is down by 42% since the start of Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea more than 3 months ago. And trade via the Panama Canal is down 36% in the past months because of low water levels, a byproduct of the climate crisis. Whether the cause is conflict or climate, the result is the same: disruption to global supply chains and increased costs for everybody. And developing economies are particularly vulnerable to these disruptions. Sustainable, inclusive development hinges on peace. And delivering the Sustainable Development Goals is our most effective way of building peace and prosperity. Yet we face a development emergency. The seismic shock of the COVID-19 pandemic was followed by a sharp acceleration in global tensions and global prices when Russia invaded Ukraine. Developing economies were sent reeling. Many still are. Today's global economic outlook largely ignores the elephant in the room. Developing countries are experiencing their worst half-decade since the early 1990s. Many face unpayable debt service costs, which are now at record levels. The world's poorest countries will owe more in debt service this year than their public spending on health, education, and infrastructure combined. And meanwhile, governments are being forced to cut back on investments and in social services. All these issues will be in the agenda of the fourth International Conference on Small Island Developing States in May and the third conference on landlocked developing countries in June. Excellencies, to keep the promise of the SDGs, we need progress in two crucial areas. First, finance. We are pushing for an SDG stimulus of $500 billion annually in affordable long-term finance for developing countries. The SDG stimulus calls for urgent action on debt, including breathing space for countries facing impossible repayment schedules. I've invited a small number of heads of state to work with me to make the stimulus a reality. With your support, we can significantly and immediately increase the capital and capacity of multilateral development banks and help get developing economies back on track. Positive steps have been taken by the leadership of the banks, but there is still a long way to go. And second, we must keep working to usher in a new Bretton Woods moment with an international financial architecture that responds to the needs of all countries. And today's architecture is outdated, dysfunctional, and unfair. It favors the rich countries that designed it nearly 8 years ago. It fails to offer countries the affordable finance required to meet our shared goals. And it does not fulfill the basic foundational function of providing a financial safety net for all developing countries. The Summit of the Future will consider the need for deep reforms to make financial institutions and frameworks truly universal and inclusive. Excellencies, we must also harness the power of technology to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. From healthcare to education, from climate action to food systems, generative artificial intelligence is the most important potential tool to build inclusive, green, sustainable economies and societies. But AI is already creating risks around disinformation, privacy, and bias. It is concentrated in very few companies and even fewer companies. Technology must reduce inequalities, not reproduce them, or pit people against each other. AI will affect all of humankind, so we need a universal approach to deal with it. Our advisory body on artificial intelligence reflects the central convening role of the United Nations, bringing together governments, private companies, academia, and the civil society. The body's recommendations will feed into the Global Digital Compact proposed for adoption at the Summit of the Future. We must move fast, be creative, and work together to ensure adequate guardrails and ethical standards, promote transparency, and build capacities in developing countries. Artificial intelligence must not replace human agency. It was created by humans and must always be under human control. Excellencies, we must also make peace with the planet. Humanity has waged a war we can only lose, our war with nature. It is a crazy fight to pick. We are detonating systems that sustain us, spewing out emissions causing our climate to implode, poisoning land, sea, and air with pollution, and decimating biodiversity, causing ecosystems to collapse. We have many important milestones, including October's UN Biodiversity Conference, November's COP29, and December's conference on the UN Convention to combat desertification. Excellencies, the climate crisis remains the defining challenge of our time. And the coming years will largely determine whether we can limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. To stay within that limit, we must cut emissions 45% by 2030 compared with 2010 levels. And we need emissions to have peaked by 2025. The good news is we have never been better equipped to prevent climate breakdown, and the benefits of renewables are clearer every year. We must seize the momentum by taking action in 3 areas: national determined contributions, phasing out fossil fuels, and finance. By 2025, every country must commit to national climate plans aligned with 1.5 degree limit. And I'm mobilizing the entire UN system to assist countries to do so. New national plans should cover all emissions and sectors, and they should map a just transition to clean energy. And they must be backed up by robust policies and regulations from an effective carbon price to ending fossil fuel subsidies. For developing countries, this is a chance to create national climate plans that double as national transition plans and national investment plans, to attract capital investments, to chart a just transition to a net zero future, and to underpin sustainable development for generations to come. For the G20, this is an opportunity to show true leadership on the global stage by accelerating a just, equitable fossil fuel phase-out. Excellencies, the fossil fuel era is on its last legs. The renewable energy revolution is unstoppable. But we must act this year to ensure that the transition is just for people and planet, and that it will be fast enough to prevent full-on climate catastrophe. That requires tripling global renewable energy capacity and doubling energy efficiency by 2030, as agreed at COP28. And it means working to ensure the production and trade of minerals critical to the energy transition are just, sustainable, and provide maximum added value in the countries supplying the raw materials in the first place. Developing countries must not be only producers of raw materials, they must be much higher in the level and capacity to transform them. The panel on critical energy transition minerals will develop voluntary principles by the end of the year. Excellencies, a just transition means urgent action to unlock the finance developing countries need to leapfrog fossil fuel dependence while bringing clean power to all. Our Climate Solidarity Pact urges big emitters to make extra efforts to cut emissions and wealthier countries to support emerging economies to do so. And I urge countries to put it into effect. And I welcome Brazil's commitment to bring climate and finance discussions together as G20 president. At a minimum, developed countries must clarify the delivery of the $100 billion per year and explain how they will double adaptation funding to at least $40 billion a year by 2025. And at COP29, all countries must agree on an ambitious new climate finance goal. We should explore innovative sources of climate finance, and the Loss and Damage Fund must be up and running as quickly as possible and with significant contributions. Countries on the front line of climate chaos are entitled to far greater support. Excellencies, this is a full agenda. Is one form or another, every element connects to the most essential of all human endeavors, the pursuit of peace. Peace can achieve wonders that wars never will. Wars destroy, peace builds. But in today's troubled world, building peace is a conscious, bold, and even radical act. It's humanity's greatest responsibility, and that responsibility belongs to us all, individually and collectively. In this difficult and divided moment, let's meet that obligation for today and future generations, starting here, starting now. For my part, I can guarantee that I will never give up fighting for peace, and I thank you.
I thank the Secretary General of the United Nations. As mentioned earlier, I will now suspend the meeting for an informal meeting. The formal meeting will then resume for delegations to deliver statements under Agenda Item 110. The formal plenary meeting is now suspended. I call to order this informal meeting on the priorities of the Secretary General of the United Nations for 2024. This meeting will not have a pre-established list of speakers. In order to request the floor, delegations are kindly requested to press the microphone button. Those speaking on behalf of a group should inform the Secretariat in order to be given priority in the speaking order. As mentioned earlier, members are reminded that this segment will be followed by the resumption of the formal meeting, in which delegations will have an opportunity to deliver statements under Agenda Item 110. In order to hear as many speakers as possible within the limited time, may I request delegations to make their interventions concise and not longer than 2 minutes when speaking in their national capacity and 3 minutes when speaking on behalf of a group. I thank you for your cooperation. The chair recognizes His Excellency Peter Szijjártó, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Hungary.
Thank you, President. Great to see you again. Dear Secretary General, thank you so much for your great speech about the necessity of peace, which is very timely given the fact that we are living in the age of dangers. The world has been confronted with tremendous challenges. And I think it's not an exaggeration to say that since the conclusion of the Second World War, the global security is in its worst shape. And we are confronted with the chance of an outbreak of a third world war more than ever before. Therefore, I totally agree with you that the goal of the international community, the number one goal of the international community, should be to stand up for peace and to fight against terror. And I do believe that a successful fight against terrorist organizations and standing up for peace are representing the only way to save lives of the people. And you are right. Many of the member states have not been respecting the UN principles. But in the meantime, I think we have to recognize that many international organizations have failed when it comes to standing up for peace and fighting against terror, which increases the significance of the United Nations, which has to take this role. Secretary General, dear President, I'm representing a country in the neighborhood of which the anti-terror fight must be successful, but in the meantime, we have to save lives of the civilians. We have to make sure that the hostages are released. I'd like to ask the Secretary General and the member states to make all the possible efforts to avoid escalation in these two conflicts, in Ukraine and the Middle East, because in case just one another country gets involved in any of these two conflicts, then these conflicts will not be stopped at the border of that given country, and a regional war or a threat of a global war will be realistic. Finally, Mr. President and dear Secretary General, we all know that based on these conflicts and challenges which have been listed by the Secretary General, the world has been faced with a tremendous dilemma. A tremendous dilemma about the future of the world. Whether the world's going to be divided into blocks again or connectivity will take over. And we Hungarians do have a very sad historic experience. We have lost 40 years of our lives as the world used to be divided into blocks. And we do not want to be losers again. We do not want to see the world to be divided into blocks again. To the contrary, in case of connectivity, mutual advantages will be as a result. Therefore, we do have to bring back the mutual respect into international politics. Bringing back mutual respect will be a very important step in order to make the age of dangers into an age of peace and sustainable development. I do believe, dear Secretary General and Mr. President, that the United Nations should take the lead in this effort. And even more, the United Nations General Assembly, which is the biggest and most democratic body of global politics, has to take an important role here, to stand up for peace and to make sure that escalation will be avoided, both when it comes to the war in Ukraine and when it comes to conflict in the Middle East. If we are able if we are able to avoid escalation in these two cases, then I think we can contribute to the security of the world in the future. Mr. Secretary General, Mr. President, you can count on Hungary as your true ally when it comes to standing up for peace, when it comes to saving lives of the people, and when it comes to fight against terrorist organizations. I hope we will be able to work together to these goals in a successful manner. You can count on us, definitely. Thank you so much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Hungary and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uganda, speaking on behalf of the Group of 77 and China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Group of 77 and China. At the onset, I would like to thank the Secretary General for indicating his priorities for 2024. Mr. President, the Group of 77 and China acknowledges that our planet is in a state of peril, facing dangers caused by war and conflicts, climate change, poverty and hunger, a global digital divide, as well as pandemics. The Group of 77 and China agrees with the Secretary General's call for the rebuilding of trust and restoring of hope. Multilateralism and international cooperation play an important role in this regard. Wars and conflicts are exacerbating humanitarian needs at a time of declining resources to respond to those needs. It is therefore urgent that the international community comes together to address the root causes of these conflicts and find lasting solutions for peace. On climate change, 2023 has had a record of being the hottest year. It's now time to turn commitments into action. The Group of 77 and China urges the full implementation of the decisions adopted during the 28th session of the Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in Dubai, in accordance with the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, including the contribution of more than 700 million to the Loss and Damage Fund to address the losses and damages associated to the effects of climate change in developing countries. The G77 and China agree with the Secretary General that there is a need for a global financial system that delivers for all. The international structures of finance, production, and trade, including agricultural trade, must be made fairer and equitable. There is an imperative need for debt restructuring and review of austerity programs for debt repayment plans to support global efforts towards sustainable development and debt-long sustainability. The group supports shifting away from relying on GDP alone as a criterion to determine access to concessional finance and looks forward to discussions on the reform of the international financial architecture. Mr. President, hunger and starvation are becoming major crises in developing countries. Millions of people are over the edge into food insecurity, followed by malnutrition, mass hunger, and famine. The group echoes the Secretary General's words: if we do not feed people, we feed insecurity. Progress towards elimination of hunger and poverty is only possible if we turn our words into concrete actions for developing countries to achieve the 2030 agenda. Mr. President, it's now more apparent than ever that technology is advancing fast, and the G77 and China acknowledge that we must be part of the growth and ensure that no one is left behind. The group notes the Secretary General's call, and I quote, "The opportunities are tremendous, from transforming education and healthcare to accelerating climate action and the achievement of all the sustainable development goals," unquote. The group will take part in negotiations that will lead to the development of a global digital compact through an open, transparent, and inclusive intergovernmental process. Mr. President, the Summit of the Future will be an opportune time for the world to get back on track towards achieving the 2030 SDGs. The G77 and China pledged to actively engage in the ongoing negotiations of the Pact of the Future so that no one is left behind. Mr. President, the group is concerned about the financial situation facing the United Nations, which is due to the failure of some member states to paying their contributions on time. We continue to encourage member states to pay their contributions on time, in full, and without conditions. We encourage the Secretary General to ensure that the cash conservation measures do not negatively impact important intergovernmental processes currently ongoing at the United Nations. We continue to empathize with member states who are genuinely unable to meet their financial obligations for reasons beyond their control. Mr. President, the year 2024 contains a number of crucial milestones and events for the Sustainable Development Agenda. The group is committed to engaging constructively and actively in all the upcoming processes, such as the Fourth Seeds Conference, the LLDCs, and the Summit of the Future. In addition, the G77 and China will also participate in major events, including the Forum on Financing for Development Follow-up and the High-Level Political Forum. These events are critical in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Finally, the Group of 77 and China would like to reassure the Secretary General of our support and cooperation in reinforcing the role of the UN as it is mandated in the Charter. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Uganda speaking on behalf of G77 and China. And I now invite the distinguished representative of the European Union to take the floor.
Mr. Secretary General, Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the EU and its member states, the candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, as well as Andorra, Monaco, and San Marino, aligning themselves with this statement. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for your presentation. Most of all, we would like to commend your relentless efforts in favor of conflict prevention and mediation, addressing the root causes of conflict, support to the most vulnerable, being vigilant on addressing human rights violations and abuses, and fighting poverty. We share your assessment that despite some notable progress, the world is facing multiple crises that are increasingly complex and interconnected. From the Middle East to the Sahel, from Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine to the Horn of Africa, from Haiti to Afghanistan, crises are morphing, trampling on international law and the UN Charter, and proliferating. Humanitarian access is being challenged in Ukraine, Gaza, Myanmar, Yemen, to name just a few. Mis- and disinformation are being weaponized to aggravate tensions. And as you also rightly put it, we must carefully weigh the risks and opportunities provided by digital technologies and artificial intelligence. On February 24th, we will commemorate the 2-year anniversary of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which remains an unabashed and blatant violation of the UN Charter and of the international rules-based order which the UN stands for. The ripple effects are still felt across the world, proliferating food and energy insecurity, which affect above all else the most vulnerable. The triple planetary crisis also continues to ravage our world, here again affecting the most vulnerable. Regression on social economic development and undermining human rights, in particular women's rights, needs to stop as well. To reduce poverty and inequality, solidarity, social protection, and tackling the crippling effects of debt are much needed. Your Excellency, we are at a crossroads. We have the choice either to continue down the current path of geopolitical mistrust and competition, or to cooperate effectively to address our common challenges together. Under your guidance, Mr. Secretary General, we must recommit to act together to make the world safer, rights-based, more sustainable, and more equitable. A great number of initiatives have laid the groundwork for 2024. They need to be fully implemented. We may not always agree on everything, dear friends, but we need to remember again how to respect each other and to discuss. Enough with the toxic polarization, which not only many of our people waiting for real solutions, but I bet many of us in this room as well are getting increasingly tired of. A crucial opportunity that we must seize to reinvigorate the multilateral system is the Pact for the Future. We are also looking with great hope to the upcoming LLDC and SIDS conferences and to the World Social Summit, which can be an important step for rebuilding the social contract through a comprehensive approach based on social cohesion, solidarity, health, education, decent work, and human rights protections for all. Human dignity, Mr. Secretary General, must return to the center of our deliberations. On peace and security, we support the vision laid out in your new agenda for peace. First, the need to go back to basics with a renewed commitment to multilateralism and the full and effective respect of the UN Charter. Second, the need for more investment in prevention. Third, the need to adjust UN tools to new threats and challenges so that the UN is fit for purpose. Above all, we must not let the global situation further deteriorate. Let might make right. Sabotage what the UN founders put in place for the benefit of humanity 79 years ago. We are convinced that multilateralism with the UN at its core is needed more than ever. One main important aspect of multilateralism with the UN at its core is the respect for the mandate of the UN Secretary General. We fully stand behind you, Secretary General, and the legitimacy of your office, and by your efforts as well as those of your envoys to mediate in all conflicts. The UN is a unique convener and can play a key role in mediation. We notably support UN's mediation role in Yemen, Afghanistan, and Cyprus. We place our hopes in the new senior humanitarian coordinator for Gaza to quickly and sustainably step up humanitarian aid in the Strip. We further call on more involvement and more leadership from the UN in Myanmar. The past year has been a very difficult year for UN peace operations, with an unprecedented wave of forced closures in Sudan or, crucially, Mali, without allowing the UN the space for a proper and orderly withdrawal. Despite this wave of forced withdrawals, we believe that PKOs are still irreplaceably relevant. And at the same time, we agree that new threats require adjustments and new models of peace operations, and this is why we support your proposal of expanding the toolbox of UN peace support operations with various types of models. We are convinced that regional organizations can play an important role in this regard, and we welcome Security Council Resolution 2719 on using assessed contributions to support African Union PSOs. The current work on a multilateral support mission for Haiti shows how important it is to have more predictable and systematized mechanisms. We also stress the importance of strengthening the Peacebuilding Commission to reinforce links between peace and security, development, and human rights. Ms. Secretary General, on human rights and humanitarian issues, the EU fully supports the mainstreaming of human rights in all the activities of the UN for achieving lasting security, sustainable development, and justice. Efforts must be made to support the international human rights mechanisms, and their funding must be secured. We appreciate the efforts to counter discrimination on any ground and share your assessment on the need to preserve and expand space for civil society. Against the background of global backsliding on gender equality, we count on your support and on all UN actors to keep the full enjoyment of all human rights by all women and girls. The human rights of children and youth must also be protected. And allow me to reaffirm today the European Union's continued and equal engagement on civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights. As we face unprecedented humanitarian needs and challenges, the EU remains a strong partner and supporter of the UN coordinated humanitarian responses that put people at the center of its action. International humanitarian law must be respected in all humanitarian crises, and no one must be left behind. As we face continued rising food insecurity, the EU will remain a solid partner of multilateral action and responses to avert famine and address food insecurity. Ms. Secretary General, the SDG Summit provided a unique opportunity to acknowledge the accomplishments and, more importantly, to reverse the backsliding in the implementation of the SDGs. We welcome the commitment made at the recent high-level dialogue on financing for development and call for appropriate follow-up. The European Union remains committed to supporting a recovery based on the transition to a greener economy that is innovative, just, and inclusive. We need to channel investment to where it is needed the most. We need a collaborative approach to address the complexities of financing development. It is crucial to bring together diverse stakeholders. Such collaboration can foster good governance, transparency, anti-corruption, as well as greater coherence policies. In tandem, the triple planetary crisis constitutes an existential threat for people and the planet.
Ambassador,
I am wrapping up.
Ambassador, with the greatest of regret.
Yes, Mr. President, the rest of the statement is on file.
Thank you kindly. And may I use this opportunity to remind all members that the rules of the game state 2 minutes for member states speaking in their national capacities and 3 minutes speaking on behalf of groups. We have a very long list of speakers, and so our time management is going to be very important. Thank you all for your cooperation. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Botswana, speaking on behalf of landlocked developing countries and also the African group.
President of the General Assembly, Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, and distinguished delegates. I have the honor to make this brief intervention on behalf of the group of landlocked developing countries. We thank the Secretary General for his briefing on his priorities for 2024. Excellencies, in the current global landscape, marked by interconnected challenges and complexities, the need for the United Nations and multilateralism is crucial for the LLDC more than ever. Our group of countries face unique challenges such as climate change, effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, economic disparities, and socioeconomic instabilities that transcend national borders, demanding collaborative and coordinated efforts. What sets us apart from other countries is that these crises affect us more severely as the economic lifeline of our countries are broadly dependent on trade, which is reliant on smooth transit and transport systems. Unfortunately, the effectiveness of these systems is often dependent on our neighboring countries. In this regard, for the LLDCs, the support from the United Nations and other international organizations is acutely needed, whether it be from the UNDS, from our socioeconomic development, the IFIs for our infrastructure, or the WTO for the rules-based trading system. The international financial architect, therefore, needs to be revitalized and strengthened in such a way that it can better serve the countries that need the international organizations the most. Excellencies, we have not had anything contrary to the fact that LLDCs are vulnerable to and remain negatively affected by the adverse impacts of climate change. Yet we don't have a voice in the climate change process as a group. We will therefore continue to pursue this matter in consideration of the magnitude of the challenges that we continue to face. Not to be left behind, LLDCs need a fair share of global climate finance and equitable representation in the decision-making process. We also seek support for our countries to develop resilient infrastructure that has the potential to promote sustainable development. We appreciate the Secretary General for attending a high-level event on climate change on the margins of COP28. We were inspired by your words of encouragement and support of our group of countries. Dear colleagues, as we prepare for the summit of the future to be held in September this year, we look forward to the decisive and concrete solutions with respect to debt sustainability, sustainable and quality development finance that prioritizes LLDCs. As you would be aware, we are in the preparatory process for the third UN conference on LLDCs to be held in Kigali, Rwanda. We commend the co-chairs of the preparatory committee, ambassadors of Austria and Mongolia, for successfully leading this important process. We believe that the 5 priority areas of action on the draft program of actions are ambitious, forward-looking, and reflective of the LLDC's developmental aspirations for the next 10 years. We therefore seek the full support of member states, the Secretary General, the President of General Assembly, and the entire UN system as we take these LLDC's specific priorities forward to Kigali and beyond. We thank you, Secretary General, for confirming your participation in the LLDC's 3 conference. We reiterate the call for all delegates and UN agencies to be represented in Kigali at the highest level possible. Mr. President, I further have the honor to deliver a statement on behalf of the African Group. I wish to extend my sincere condolences to the mission, the government, and the people of the Republic of Namibia following the passing on of His Excellency President Hage Geingob. The African Group aligns itself with a statement delivered by Uganda on behalf of G77 and China. We express our gratitude to the Secretary General for outlining his priorities for 2024, which include the development of Africa. Excellencies, we acknowledge with deep concern the multitude of crises facing Africa, from conflicts to health emergencies and socioeconomic disparities. These multifaceted challenges, including the lingering effects of COVID-19 pandemic, food, energy, and financial crisis, as well as threats of conflict and insecurity, demand comprehensive solutions. It would also be recalled that Africa hosts over 25% of the world's refugee population, with 36 million displaced due to conflict and instability, and nearly 416 million people living in extreme poverty. In this context, we commend the Secretary General for his collaboration and coordination with the African Union in addressing these challenges in accordance with aspirations set out in the 2030 Agenda and Agenda 2063. The African Group also appreciates the African Union for its role in peacekeeping and conflict resolution across the continent. The partnership between the AU and the United Nations, especially in peacekeeping missions and conflict resolution efforts, exemplifies effective collaboration towards peace, security, and sustainable development in Africa. This synergy underscores the UN's crucial support in amplifying the AU's peace and stability initiative. Mr. President, climate change significantly affects Africa, with droughts, floods, and desertification threatening livelihoods of millions, particularly of women and children. The vast majority of Africa's population depends on agriculture and is highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Despite contributing to least to global emissions, Africa faces severe related challenges affecting food security and water. Thank you, Excellencies.
Can I appeal? I'd like to thank the distinguished representative of Botswana for her statement. And before giving the floor to the distinguished representative of Tonga, can I appeal to members, please, to observe the timelines set for the conduct of this debate? We are pressed because we have an extremely long list of speakers. And if we are to get through that list, it would be very important from here on to stay within the established timelines. Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tonga.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the pleasure to take the floor on behalf of the members of the Pacific Islands Forum with presence at the United Nations, namely Australia, the Federated States of Micronesia, Fiji, Kiribati, Nauru, New Zealand, Palau, Papua New Guinea, Republic of the Marshall Islands, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, Vanuatu, and my own country, Tonga. We acknowledge the guidance and support of the Cook Islands as chair of the Pacific Islands Forum. On behalf of the Forum, we would like to express our collective appreciation for your significant contributions to multilateral diplomacy over the course of your more than 7 years in office. We recognize the unprecedented strain on much of the United Nations system and its staff throughout this period, and we are grateful for your continued leadership. We also welcome your briefing this morning on your priorities for the remainder of 2024. Mr. Secretary General, as you have outlined, the challenges we face today are numerous and can only be overcome by working together in partnership, trust, and solidarity, and by embracing multilateralism in a renewed spirit of cooperation. This is particularly true for one of the challenges you have highlighted and which the Pacific Island Forum has long declared to be the defining challenge of our time, climate change. This September, the General Assembly will hold two important meetings to advance action on the issue of climate change, the Summit of the Future, and the recently mandated high-level meeting on addressing the urgent impacts of sea level rise. For members of the Pacific Island Forum, the success of each of these meetings is critical. We recognize that each meeting is distinct from the other in terms of mandates, possible modalities, and potential outcomes, and we plan to engage in each meeting on its own merits. Nevertheless, the links between the meetings are evident. On that basis, Mr. Secretary General, we welcome your views on how we can ensure that the results of each meeting appropriately reinforce the other without prejudice to each meeting's preferred process. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Tonga, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Denmark to take the floor on behalf of the Nordic countries.
Excellencies, dear colleagues, I deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark. Secretary General, in the past years, we have seen some bright spots for multilateralism, not least the historic BBNJ agreement and the achievements at COP28. Yet, we undoubtedly face a challenging landscape, as you have so eloquently summarized this morning. The Summit of the Future will define much of our work this year, and the Nordic countries stand ready to work constructively with all countries toward a summit and a pact that is action-oriented and focused on solutions. We're deeply concerned about the flare-up of conflicts and human suffering around the world, while mistrust in the multilateral system has weakened our collective ability to counter these challenges. We must reverse these developments. We support your approach, Secretary General, in the new Agenda for Peace to strengthen foresight and prevention. We must also be mindful of the gender perspective when analyzing situations and defining policy responses. We commend your unwavering commitment to international humanitarian law in face of complex conflicts, and we stand behind your insistence on the impartiality of UN organizations and personnel. As always, you have the Nordic countries' full support, and we encourage you to continue your proactive approach. Secretary General, the Nordics are also deeply concerned about the UN's liquidity crisis. We call upon all member states to pay their assessed contributions with predictability and transparency. Predictability of payments is key to the UN's ability to plan and execute its budget, and hence its ability to deliver on the mandates decided by the member states. Human rights underpin the work of the entire UN system and are also essential to addressing causes of crisis and in building sustainable and peaceful societies. We fully support your call to action for human rights, and we commend the mainstreaming and cross-pillar activities, including on gender equality and protection of civic space. Finally, 2024 will be crunch time for invigorating multilateralism and delivering on our commitments, including those adopted at the SDG Summit. It is crucial that we can demonstrate renewed commitment to leaving no one behind. The upcoming SITS 4 and LDC 3 conferences will be key moments for delivering on these commitments. We must also reform our multilateral institutions to reflect the world of today. We must force stronger cooperation with regional actors and organizations, and we need to handle the interlinkages between climate, development, and humanitarian crisis. We must make the summit of the future count. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Denmark, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nepal, speaking on behalf of the least developed countries.
I thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, and distinguished delegates, I have the honor to make these remarks on behalf of the group of the least developed countries. I highly appreciate the Secretary General for the comprehensive report, as well as the briefing about the priorities for the year 2024. We extend our sincere thankfulness to you, Mr. Secretary General, for prioritizing the agenda of sustainable development. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, in the year 2023, we lived in crisis and challenges. Rising poverty, growing inequality, worsening food crisis, rising unemployment, and uneven and uncertain global economic outlook resulting from heightening geopolitical tensions, climate catastrophe, and increasing conflicts. The group of the least developed countries has been bearing the consequences of this crisis disproportionately. At the midpoint of the 2030, the LDCs have made very limited progress in the SDGs. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, amidst the difficult times came the strong commitment from the international organizations and development partners in Doha Program of Action. Our priorities too go along the lines laid out by you, Mr. Secretary General, for this year. LDCs have placed their full emphasis on poverty eradication, food security, creating employment opportunities, and reducing inequalities, among others. Sustainable development and peace and security are inextricably linked. Considering the perpetual lack of resources for development, adequate and consistent funding is necessary to fill the gap and allow the system to flexibly function and support the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. International financial institutions and multinational development banks need to enhance LDC's specific funding windows to better match the needs and capacities of the LDCs. The LDCs therefore look forward to the summit of the future and hope that it will set a clear and decisive tone that will lay the foundation for a forward-looking and ambitious future for all of us. We reaffirm our fullest support and cooperation to the upcoming 4th UN Conference on SIDS and 3rd UN Conference for LDCs and look forward to their successful conclusion. We also look forward to a new global climate deal with a package containing ambitious emissions cuts to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees and loss and damage fund, and the new collective quantified goal on climate finance meeting the level of ambitions. The LDCs remain committed to working with you, Mr. Secretary General, and will remain engaged throughout the year. Although we couldn't have a good beginning of the year, we can save the rest of the year to bring sustainable development back on track. We assure you of our full support and cooperation in implementing your priorities. I thank you for your attention.
I'd like to thank the distinguished representative of Nepal and now invite the distinguished representative of Mexico to take the floor.
Señor,
Mr. President, esteemed colleagues, Mexico recognizes and supports the solid leadership of the Secretary General in the face of the unprecedented gravity of the challenges that we are facing, and we would like to thank you for introducing to us your priorities for 2024. Very few global leaders have either understood or have the sense of urgency in the face of current events as outlined by the Secretary General. We agree with the Secretary General that it is essential that we make progress on the reform of the organization in order to restore general trust in multilateralism. As a part of this shared vision, we are committed to working constructively towards the success of the Summit of the Future. We are aware that in order to achieve a result which is commensurate with expectations, we should collectively reduce the polarization that we see and set our global goals above short-term interests. We call upon member states to concentrate their energies on building a pact for the future that will genuinely be translated into action. We should strengthen the multiple areas of progress that have already been achieved in the area of human rights and gender rights and cooperation, development cooperation, to cite a few examples, and build a new strategy that is based on overcoming obstacles in order to bring about a fairer, more prosperous, and more peaceful world. Mr. President, in this spirit, we would like to mention some aspects of particular interest to Mexico, and they are amongst the priorities mentioned by the Secretary General. Firstly, we would echo the message of the Secretary General to give greater priority to the triple crisis of climate change, biodiversity, and pollution that we are experiencing. Our efforts in environmental fora should be more coordinated, and it is imperative that we raise our level of collective ambition. On the other hand, Mexico believes that the Digital Compact is an opportunity to strengthen the principle that the digital transformation, and in particular that of the development of artificial intelligence, must be to the benefit of people, and above all, it should close the gaps of inequality. Additionally, we are committed to strengthening international cooperation in order to bring about safe, orderly, and regular migration that will have a positive impact on the communities of origin, transit, and destination. In conclusion, as we have just heard, the work of the United Nations is fundamental in confronting the humanitarian crises in Palestine, Ukraine, and so many other areas of the world. We also believe that at the same time, the organization must develop its capacity to prevent conflicts by addressing the root causes in a timely fashion. In summary, we need a United Nations which, in terms of its configuration and its methods of work, is able to respond to the complex world in which we live and which better reflects the reality of the current international system. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Mexico, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Egypt to take the floor.
Thank you very much, President. I do thank the SG for this very accurate global peace outlook. Egypt commends you, Secretary General, for what the UN is doing globally for the cause of peace. Egypt thanks you for invoking Article 99 of the Charter, calling for humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. Your Secretary General, your accurate detection of all the spillover effect of the war on Gaza is exemplary. We look forward for the full operationalization of the UN mechanism for humanitarian assistance to Gaza as per UN Security Council 2720. We want UNRWA to remain fully operational. We support all the measures that you have made, and we appeal to everyone to act wisely for UNRWA to remain operational and fully functional. We thank you for reminding everyone of the fundamentals of the end game in the Middle East, two-state solutions. Egypt is working at all fronts to attain peace and to restore stability in the Middle East, quietly working with Qatar, Israel, the US for the release of the hostages, a de facto ceasefire, as well engaging in all discussions about the day after and the political horizon. We echo your call, Secretary General, for a new Bretton Woods moment. We support your calls for the IFIs to do more. That restructuring fiscal space is badly needed. You know, now countries are vulnerable to a lot of external shocks, and you're familiar with the difficulties in the Middle East economically. Your tireless work on the climate change front as well is fully supported and appreciated. Now more than ever, we need the UN to remain fully operational at its best performance and so on. Pretty much alarmed with the liquidity crisis, Secretary General. I add my voice to my Danish colleague in saying that we appeal for all countries to pay their dues, but as well, we want to have a discussion. Apparently that liquidity crisis is chronic. We need a process. We need to find sustainable mechanisms. So I am speaking as the representative of Egypt and the one chairing the fifth committee. This is what I wanted to say in brief, Mr. President. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt and now invite the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein to take the floor.
Thank you, President. I have two unscripted thoughts in response to the inspiring presentation by the SG, for which I really want to thank him. First, I really want to thank you, Secretary General, for reminding us that the raison d'etre of this organization is peace. I think there's never been a more important moment to say that, and I think the reality of our work today is that we invest a lot in mitigating the fallout of war and armed conflict, and we're investing much less in preserving peace and in preventing conflict. Armed conflict has long-term devastating consequences on everything that is important to our agenda, on the SDGs, on climate change, and on everything else. So we hope that 2024 can be a turning point for us in this respect. And there are two things that we believe are necessary and possible. One is we do have an opportunity to look at the future of peace operations. There is a chapter that is coming to a close in the area of peacekeeping, and it's a moment for us to reflect on what this organization can do in the future, and also not only on the basis of mandates from the Security Council, but also on the basis of what this assembly can do. And in the framework of the Peacebuilding Commission, we do hope that the Summit of the Future can reflect these thoughts and lead us forward. The second is that we have to invest in enforcing the rules that we have that govern the use of force, which is really the core of the Charter of the United Nations. We do have that law, but that law is not enforced. And as you have said yourself, if the UN Charter was implemented, every person on this planet would be able to live in peace. And my second thought is on climate change. And again, I want to thank you on your leadership and for outlining the three areas where we need to move forward on. And I just want to add the very important legal avenue that we have at the process in front of the International Court of Justice its advisory opinion on climate change, where we and many others are in the process of finalizing our submissions. We need the guidance from the court on the legal aspects of climate change. I thank you so much for being with us this morning.
I thank the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein and now invite the representative of Morocco to take the floor.
Thank you, President USG. At the outset, I extend to you the gratitude of my delegation for this valuable opportunity to engage in an interactive debate on our common goals for 2024. Allow me to stress some important points for my delegation. First, the organization of the Summit of the Future and the elaboration and adoption of a pact for the future are fundamental milestones in our collective response to contemporary challenges, which are unprecedented. Your program, Our Common Agenda, lays out visionary recommendations offering a historic window to strengthen our international cooperation and to engage for a common sustainable future. The 11 guidance notes that you issued contained basic, important recommendations that merit consideration, both for the Pact for the Future and the Declaration for the Future and the Digital Compact as well. We reiterate our support to a new agenda for peace. Second, we are increasingly interconnected, so the reinforcement of multilateralism with the UN at its center is vital to cope with transnational crimes and achieve the SDGs. We fully back your call for revitalization of multilateral institutions to make them more just, equitable, and to respond to the pressing challenges of our age. Thirdly, the promotion of a culture of peace and countering hate speech. These are more vital than ever today in a context at which, unfortunately, these phenomena are increasing. We need to work to eradicate hate speech and encourage initiatives for peace, cohesion, and intercultural and intercivilizational dialogue throughout the world. Fourth, Morocco reaffirms its indignation as regards the serious situation in Gaza, which has dragged on for 4 months. King Mohammed VI and Morocco are calling for a surveyed durable ceasefire, humanitarian assistance in Gaza, and the release of all prisoners of war and hostages. We support our Palestinian brothers. We reaffirm our unwavering support to the establishment of a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital within 1967 borders, living side by side with Israel. Fifth, Morocco is fully aware of the financial challenges facing the organization, especially the current liquidity crisis. We resolutely support your efforts, Mr. Secretary General, to find sustainable solutions to these challenges and to ensure that the UN has adequate resources to pursue its crucial priorities. We welcome the Secretary General's efforts to cope with the liquidity crisis explained in your letter recently. We hope that the Secretariat will acquire the liquidity necessary from member states as soon as possible to ensure that these measures can be taken. In closing, I reiterate to you, Mr. Secretary General, Morocco's full support in your leadership and your efforts at the helm of our organization, and we reiterate our commitment to support your priorities. I thank you.
The Chair thanks the distinguished representative of Morocco and now invites the distinguished representative of Thailand to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. And in listening to the Secretary General's important priorities of 2024, I'm reminded by an important and often forgotten chess opening move, which is the Queen's Gambit. But the analogy is that through that opening move, you will better allow the UN and the multilateralism to be more at the center of the chessboard of global politics and the global architecture. So in response to the various priorities, there are 3 Ps. The first is a people-centered development. This is essential to fulfill the unkept promise of attaining the SDGs. We therefore support the Secretary General's SDG stimulus, his calls for enhanced connectivity to have better supply chains, and indeed Thailand's land bridge initiative to better link the Pacific with the Indian Ocean is in that direction. The second is planet-centric approach. This is needed to heed the call of the Secretary Generals on better protection of the planet and to better address the challenge of climate change. Our bio-circular green economy approach will help contribute to this as well. And the third P is peace. We need cessation of conflicts around the world, cessation of violence based on hatred, In this connection, the new agenda for peace, as emphasized by the Secretary General, is important. We support it, and especially the three areas of enhancing the role of diplomacy in peaceful means, better promoting human security, and promoting the greater role of regional organizations to help attain this peace. And no matter what conflict we are in, the important thing is to ensure, if there are hostages, for the hostages to come home. So to conclude, Mr. President, the Secretary General has made important opening chess moves for 2024. It is now up to us, the member states, to take it through in the middle game and the end game in order to win this match to resolve the challenges to humanity in 2024. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Thailand and now offer the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Mr. President, I thank Secretary General Guterres for his briefing and generally agree with his considerations regarding the priorities of the work this year. Under the leadership of Secretary General Guterres, the United Nations has been actively responding to the challenges, risks, and uncertainties carrying out and has made great efforts for promoting sustainable peace and development, which China highly appreciates. In the face of multiple challenges in the new year, the world needs a strong United Nations. China calls on all parties to work together to tide over difficulties and fully support the United Nations in playing a central and leading role in international affairs. First, it is essential to stay firm on the right track by practicing true multilateralism and continuously advancing the vision of a community with a shared future for mankind to achieve common development, safeguard common security, and build a common future. Second, no matter how the international situation changes, the core values of the UN Charter remain unchanged. We must be committed to the purposes and principles of the Charter as the only yardstick and oppose all double standards. We need to uphold fairness and justice so that people who are suffering in Palestine and other places can see the hope of peace. Third, every effort should be made under the banner of the UN to strengthen solidarity, advocate cooperation, and reject confrontation. It is even more important for major countries to lead by example, play a constructive role, and shoulder their due responsibilities, including their financial responsibilities. Fourth, the reform of the global governance system and the United Nations must reflect the current international political realities, keep abreast to the trend of the rise of the global South, redress the historical injustices to developing countries, and make the international order more fair, just, and equitable. China will, as always, fully support the work of the Secretary General and the United Nations and work together with the international community to make further contribution to the fair cause of the United Nations. I'd like to take this opportunity to wish all the colleagues a happy Lunar New Year and a good luck in the Year of Dragon. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of China, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Secretary General, as you outlined, there are many reasons for all member states to be gravely concerned about current threats to international peace and security, development, and human rights. The United States is committed to finding and supporting solutions to these challenges. There are signs of important international cooperation to respond to these challenges, including many of those outlined in your Our Common Agenda report. This includes outcomes reached in September at the SDG Summit and in December on climate change at COP28, as well as on innovative approaches to manage international peace and security, like the UN-AU partnership through Security Council Resolution 2719, and for the first time, General Assembly approval of assessed funding for UN peacebuilding. In the year ahead, we need to review the tools that allow the international community to respond rapidly to threats to civilians, prevent mass atrocities, and counter violent extremists or terrorist groups in a way that provides stability and creates space for political solutions. We need to transform gendered power dynamics in peace and security. That means accelerating implementation of the WPS agenda, as well as addressing persistent barriers to women's participation, investing in and supporting local women leaders, and redoubling our efforts to prevent and respond to all forms of gender-based violence, including conflict-related sexual violence. At the same time, global cooperation is essential to help ensure that digital and emerging technologies are a force for good and allow for the free exercise of human rights. We acknowledge the calls to reform the international financial architecture and reiterate our commitment to evolve the vision and mandate of the multilateral development banks. The United States also supports the expansion of the Security Council in both the permanent and non-permanent categories. We look forward to continuing work with member states to develop viable solutions in a way that responds to today's global realities. We believe the Summit of the Future process is a generational opportunity to shape the future of the United Nations and can serve to reaffirm and uphold the UN Charter and the UDHR, to examine the future of UN peace operations, to affirm and strengthen conflict prevention and resolution as core functions of the organization, and to lift up the human rights pillar, as well as to find international consensus on how to collectively leverage the benefits of artificial intelligence while managing its risks, and to implement other necessary changes to the UN system to ensure that it remains fit for purpose. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States and now invite the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom to take the floor.
Thank you, President, and thank you, Secretary General, for your report. The United Kingdom is clear that multilateralism is the best tool we have to tackle the shared challenges of the 21st century. Let me highlight 3 areas. First, we must strive for peace, upholding the principles and agreements to which we have collectively committed. 2 years since its illegal invasion, Russia continues to launch indiscriminate attacks on Ukrainian civilians. In Gaza, we witnessed the harrowing impact of the humanitarian crisis on Palestinian civilians. 2024 should be the year that Russia withdraws its troops from Ukraine and ceases its aggression. And we must immediately address humanitarian need in Gaza and take action to secure a sustainable, permanent ceasefire and bring peace and security to both Israelis and Palestinians. Second, the United Kingdom is committed to ending extreme poverty, tackling climate change and biodiversity loss, and promoting gender equality. We will champion action to accelerate progress towards the SDGs, including through UN and international financial system reform. UK priorities will be mobilizing more and better development and climate financing, and promoting greater access to education, economic opportunities, and the protection of sexual and reproductive health rights for all women and girls. And finally, we look forward to the Summit of the Future as an opportunity to rebuild trust and strengthen the multilateral system. The UK is concerned by the financial challenges facing the organization, and we are committed to stabilizing UN finances to ensure that the organization can serve those in need. The UK looks forward to working with you and all member states in the year ahead. Thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Japan to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President and Secretary General. Allow me to express our appreciation for organizing this meeting and sharing the Secretary General's priority in 2024. I would like to join SG wishing for peace for all, and moreover, to join his determination to act for the peace. The international community faces complex crises and heightened geopolitical tensions, along with devastating humanitarian crises in the Middle East, Ukraine, and many other parts of the world, as SG addressed with urgency. The need to reinvigorate multilateralism is more crucial than ever demanding collective efforts to overcome divisions and address these multifaceted challenges. The upcoming Summit of the Future presents an invaluable opportunity to strengthen the functions of the UN and to underscore the fundamental principles of multilateralism, including respect for human dignity and rule of law. Japan welcomes the recent release of the SG's report on human security and looks forward to further deepening discussion on human security with member states, recognizing its potential as catalyst for advancing the SDG, and the SDG is a way to advance peace, as SG said. Looking towards the future, Japan is committed to concrete discussions in intergovernmental negotiations process on Security Council's reform, aiming to better reflect today's world and to restore trust in the UN. The significance of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation cannot be overstated. We need to foster momentum for nuclear disarmament and make realistic and practical efforts to realize a world without nuclear weapon for our future generations. Japan will engage ourselves constructively to contribute furthering these discussions. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Japan, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Singapore.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I wish to make 4 points. First, I'd like to thank the Secretary General for his very strong and dynamic leadership over the past year. In particular, I commend him and thank him for his clarity of vision and very principled position as an advocate for the interests of developing countries, in particular, small states. I also want to acknowledge the contributions made by the senior officials of the leadership team, in particular Deputy Secretary General, as well as others who work hard to make a contribution both here and in the field. Second, the strength of the multilateral system lies in its ability to create peace. And the key to building peace is respect for international law and the principles of the UN Charter. And at a moment when multilateralism is being challenged, it is important that we reinforce respect for international law and the UN Charter. We cannot allow violations of international law to become normal or normalized, and respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity must be the foundation of the multilateral system that we all must collectively seek to protect and defend. And I want to thank the Secretary General for also being a strong advocate for the respect of international law. Thirdly, we welcome the focus that the Secretary General presented earlier this morning on the need for reform and transformation of the multilateral architecture. Even as we deal with the challenges of peace and security, as well as the implementation of the SDG goals, we have to deal with emerging issues of the future, such as digital technologies, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and a range of other issues. In this context, the Summit of the Future will be a crucial multilateral milestone that will determine the relevance, resilience, and the strength of the United Nations. It is an opportunity that we must seize to make the UN relevant to the lives of our people. I want to conclude with another point on the liquidity crisis. It seems that the UN and the multilateral system has been lurching from one liquidity crisis to another. And each one of us here, as members of the United Nations, have to live up to our charter obligations to pay our assessed contributions in full and on time. The irony is that some of the biggest contributors are also the biggest champions of the multilateral rules-based system, but yet they do not make their contributions in full and on time. It's time to stop. It's time to put an end to the liquidity crisis, because this is happening far too frequently. This affects the implementation of mandates. This weakens the United Nations, and this is going to have an impact on the lives of our people. I would therefore support the call made by my good friend, the Ambassador of Egypt, to see how we can confront this issue frontally with transparency and accountability, because we all have to live up to our charter obligations. So thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Singapore, and I now ask the distinguished representative of Pakistan to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, first of all, let me thank the distinguished Secretary General for his very comprehensive and eloquent statement outlining his priorities. We admire the Secretary General's spirit, his stamina and perseverance, and his vision for international cooperation. We agree that the United Nations should play a central role in the preservation of international order, peace and security, development, and human rights. It is with this background that I would like to make 4 points, and I hope that these will be seen in the context of our full support for the Secretary General and his vision. The first is that in order to deal with the future, we must first address the present. And the present is a disturbing scene of violations of the UN Charter, of flagrant aggression, of a series of unilateral actions and foreign interventions against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of numerous states, mostly in the global south. And unless we are able to show the determination to respond to these violations of the UN Charter, our prescriptions and promises for the future will lack credibility. Secondly, the failure of the United Nations, and particularly the Security Council, for which reforms are necessary, these failures are not related to representation, except the representation of 5 permanent members who, some of whom, have utilized their veto-wielding power to prevent aggression, to prevent the use of force, and even to prevent the genocide that is currently taking place. We need to reform the Security Council first and foremost by ensuring the representation of the membership of the United Nations, which are mostly small and medium states, not large powers. And therefore, the creation of new permanent members is going to add to the paralysis of the Security Council. It will multiply the possibilities of vetoes and of paralysis. We must therefore focus on removing and limiting the veto and ensuring representation for the small and medium states rather than creating new permanent members. Thirdly, on development, we, the developing countries, have received commitments ad nauseum in the 2030 agenda, in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, and most recently in the SDG Summit Declaration. But the problem is not that we have few commitments. The problem is the weakness of implementation. None of these commitments that we have received as developing countries have been honored. There are deficits of solidarity that we have witnessed during the COVID crisis. And the problems that we face arose from that lack of solidarity and the lack of implementation of the commitments as such. So we do not need to be led from conference to conference, from promise to promise. We need implementation of what has already been promised and committed, and that is where the focus should be. My last point, Mr. President. We all have entertained hopes in the summit of the future as an opportunity where we can bring together the solidarity and international cooperation that we all aspire to. But I must tell you with all frankness that we are off to a very bad start. The first draft of the pact that we have received does not reflect the priorities of the developing countries. It does not reflect the grave violations of the UN Charter that are happening. It does not reflect the aggressions that are taking place with impunity against the peoples of the developing countries as such. We will therefore need to submit massive amendments to ensure that the pact is one that reflects the views of the vast majority of the UN membership and not of a select few as such. And I hope that we can count on the support of the Secretary General in this effort that we will make to ensure that our pact for the future is one that is equitable, it is just, and it responds to the aspirations of the majority of the UN membership. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, I thank the Secretary General for sharing your priorities in 2024. The state of the world in 2024 is marked by instability and by multiple crises that are increasingly complex, severe, and interconnected. Many pressing problems demand our attention and efforts. First and foremost, peace and stability are the core prerequisites for solutions to other global challenges. This, once again, reminds and calls upon member states to uphold and adhere to international law and the UN Charter, to refrain from the use of force, and to settle disputes by peaceful means. We support the Secretary General's initiatives and good offices in this regard. More broadly, we welcome the new Agenda for Peace and find many of the recommendations useful. The Summit of the Future is an opportunity to strengthen international cooperation, renew and deliver our collective commitment to peace, prosperity, and sustainable development for future generations. Vietnam's priorities and participation throughout the process will be guided by a people-centered approach. We thank the Secretary General for his important support in the building up to the summit. We commend his leadership in galvanizing international support for accelerated SDG implementation and climate finance, including through initiatives such as the SDG stimulus and the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. My delegation has been working hard to support and implement these initiatives, and we stand ready to cooperate with the Secretary General and other member states for the achievement of our collective goals. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Vietnam, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Malaysia to take the floor.
Mr. President, my delegation would like to thank the Secretary General for presenting his priorities for 2024. We align ourselves with the statement delivered by Uganda on behalf of the Group of 77 and China. The challenges facing our world demand a unified as well as a resolute response, and we commend the Secretary General's commitment to addressing these challenges. We have heard loud and clear the aspiration and the visionary priorities set out by the Secretary General. We share the same concern on the regression of achievement of the SDGs. We desire the same outcome, and that is for long and lasting peace. The human toll of conflicts is immeasurable, and the time for decisive action is now. To this end, Malaysia reiterates our commitment to contribute constructively to the Summit of the Future. The summit is an important opportunity to reinvigorate multilateralism and strengthen global governance, as well as to tackle the global issues of our time. As the Secretary General rightly pointed out, this includes the need for reform of the international financial architecture and finding just and lasting peace in regions plagued by the conflicts. It is essential that our efforts translate into concrete changes on the ground, and this should be reflected in the Pact for the Future. Mr. President, rest assured, Malaysia stands ready to contribute and collaborate towards this endeavor. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malaysia, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Switzerland to take the floor.
Mr. President, thank you for reminding what is important for all human beings to live in peace and freedom and realize their full potential.
The sphere in which it thrives, a écrit la philosophe Cissé Labocque, et la confiance.
Cissé Labocque, and confidence has allowed the Assembly to renew friendly relations and avoid another global collapse and to formulate a vision of the future we want. Today, that future is hanging by a thread. And you've just been explaining the reasons for that, Secretary General. So many conflicts, hunger and inequalities, combined with a lack of political will, transparency and trust. And with this loss of trust, friendships are likely to erode too. There is no miracle cure for repairing relationships and rebuilding trust, but three elements are certainly essential, and they are dialogue, compromise, and credibility. First, there must be an open and transparent dialogue between states, international organizations, and other players. The UN must continue to serve as a key platform for this dialogue. And there can be no transparency without the fight against disinformation. Advances in artificial intelligence are forcing us to redouble our efforts to distinguish the true from the false. We need verified facts and scientific evidence to be able to make sustainable decisions. And then we need real compromises in word and deed. Small reciprocal steps that will help us to build long-term trust. At the same time, we must avoid blocking ourselves by backtracking on long-standing consensuses. Indeed, it is precisely respect for agreed standards and implementation of agreed compromises that create the credibility needed to build trust. This applies to the United Nations Charter and multilateral treaties, as well as to objectives such as the Agenda 2030. Finally, trust in the multilateral system is just as important as trust between nations. Trust is also built through scientific collaboration, through a shared understanding of how we want to design the new spaces for our joint action, particularly in the digital field. Mr. President, this year there is no shortage of opportunities to strengthen confidence in the multilateral system. The road to the Summit of the Future, the summit itself, 75 years of the Geneva Conventions, and for Switzerland, its second presidency of the Security Council in October will also be inspired by the new agenda for peace. It is up to us to seize these opportunities. Let us be ambitious in forging a new consensus that takes account of the needs of present and future generations. I can assure you, Mr. President, of Switzerland's determination to build trust, seek consensus, and engage constructively throughout the year. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Switzerland, and I now invite the distinguished representative of El Salvador to take the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, President, Secretary General, Excellencies. El Salvador endorses the statement of the distinguished representative of Uganda on behalf of the G77 and China. My delegation is grateful for the presentation of this report of the Secretary General on the work of the organization, as well as his priorities for 2024. In a context of multiple crises that generate a negative impact on developing countries, and in particular, given the serious conflicts that have led to violence, death, and destruction in recent years, we recognize the need to drive forward urgent global action in order to achieve lasting peace and eradicate poverty and hunger, promote human rights and the development of our nations, to strengthen humanitarian assistance for peoples that need it, as well as to promote the strengthening of multilateralism in general. The combination of strategic alliances and the mobilization of resources are key to ensure sustained economic growth and sustainable development, as well as to promote dialogue between the United Nations and other actors of the international economic system, including cooperation between the Secretary-General, ECOSOC, the G20, and the international financial institutions in order to overcome the challenges being faced by the global south, including the need to carry out a reform of the financial architecture. It's indispensable that we address the development financing challenges following a multi-dimensional approach over and above taking the economic perspective as the only reference for the development of countries and access to resources. We must take into account the reality of middle-income countries. They are facing specific challenges and require multi-dimensional criteria in order to access financing for development, technical cooperation, and capacity building. When it comes to climate change, it's indispensable to continue to work to find new climate solutions that are transformative and that will be of benefit to populations in the regions most affected by climate change. We recognize the operationalization of the new Loss and Damage Fund. This is a historic milestone, as well as the importance of the contributions and promises that have been made in this regard. We stressed the importance of moving away from the use of fossil fuels agreed at COP28, which is crucial to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. And we call upon the Secretary General and the entire United Nations system to continue to work to ensure an effective energy transition and strengthen efforts in the area of adaptation and mitigation on the base mitigation. Disarmament should continue to be a priority as well for the work of the organization in the context of turbulent times that we are witnessing: armed conflicts, proliferation of conventional weapons, an increase in military expenditure. All of this diverting significant resources away from achieving sustainable development, which is what we, the peoples of the world, aspire to. The Summit of the Future and the Pact for the Future should be a valuable opportunity to innovate and promote actions and commitments that will make it possible to provide a response and address the multiple and interrelated challenges and crises that we see in the world at the moment, based on global solidarity and strengthened multilateralism. In conclusion, Mr. President, El Salvador reiterates its support for the United Nations Organization, for the good offices of the Secretary General, in order to strengthen multilateralism based on a renewed vision. The United Nations must meet the needs of its member states, particularly of developing countries. Thank you very much.
El Salvador for his statement. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Panama.
Gracias, señor presidente. Señor...
Thank you, Mr. President. Secretary General, the successes are well known, as well as the crises that we're facing as humanity. We agree that the greatest impact of these challenges and crises will always be on the most poor and vulnerable people. They suffer the greatest consequences, limiting the possibility to exercise their full rights. We highlight the importance of a human rights-based approach in the development initiatives as one of the clear ways to continue to meet the goals of the organization and forge a better future. It's essential to recognize that progress and peace can only be achieved fully if women actively participate in all areas of society, in particular in building lasting peace. Panama supports the efforts and goals promoted by the Secretary General to reduce the gender gap and in order to bring about sustainable human development. In this sense, the Women, Peace and Security agenda is a priority for Panama and will guide our efforts to occupy a seat as non-permanent member in the Security Council in the period 2025-2026. We're firm believers in inclusion, dialogue, and multilateralism, and we recognize the Office of United Nations for Youth. They will ensure that the voice, interests, and perspectives of young people are heard in all decision-making fora multilaterally. We support the efforts driven forward by the Secretary-General to promote the use of renewable energy in order to reduce pollution by fossil fuels and win the battle against climate change. Similarly, we would like to thank the Secretary-General for highlighting the holding of the first International Day of Clean Energy that was on the 26th of January in accordance with Resolution 77/327, an initiative promoted jointly by Panama and the United Arab Emirates. Mr. President, we reiterate our full support for and our constructive commitment during this session to advance on our common priorities and goals. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Panama, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Equatorial Guinea.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. My statement aligns with those made by the statement made by Uganda on behalf of the non-aligned countries and the Group of 77 and China, and by Botswana on behalf of the African Group. And above all, I would like to thank and congratulate the Secretary-General, Mr. António Guterres, for his brilliant intervention as he introduced his report on the work of the organization. The statement of the Secretary-General has been very clear, amongst other things, with regard to the imperative necessity of peace returning to the world and the urgent need for Africa to be represented in the permanent category of Security Council members, the need for a ceasefire in Gaza, the fight against climate change, and decisive support to developing countries so that nobody is left behind as part of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Secretary-General, our clear determination is to continue to implement these priorities. They are detailed in your report for 2024, and we commend you on these goals. We commend you and all of your team in the United Nations. And I believe I'm not wrong in saying that you have the support of Africa in general and of Equatorial Guinea in particular. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, our requirements that we of the Secretary-General to ensure that these goals are achieved must be accompanied by addressing the acute problem of liquidity being currently faced by our organization. We need to pay our contributions. So I wish you all the best, Secretary-General, in your noble work for the good of humanity. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Equatorial Guinea, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Zimbabwe to take the floor.
Mr. President, I wish to express the sincere appreciation of Zimbabwe for the Secretary General's leadership. Following the comprehensive presentation of the Secretary General's priorities for 2024, it is imperative that we all reaffirm our commitment to the strengthening of multilateralism and rebuilding trust on its utility. Zimbabwe totally agrees that in a world plagued by multiple crises, escalating conflicts, growing divisions, and inequalities, the need for unified action has never been more urgent. As we navigate these complex challenges, our overarching objective should be to accelerate the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its 17 SDGs, which remains our blueprint for building a more just, inclusive, and prosperous world. This requires not only political will, but also tangible and sustainable resources and effective cooperation at all levels. It is evident that 2024 will be a pivotal year for small island developing states and landlocked developing countries within the United Nations framework. The upcoming conference is focused on the unique situation and needs of these groups, present an opportunity to address their specific challenges and work out how best to collectively advance their sustainable development agendas. The specter of the climate crisis continues to threaten the very existence of our planet, demanding immediate and decisive action. We agree with you, Secretary General, on the need to redouble our efforts to mitigate its effects and transition towards a sustainable future in line with the Paris Agreement and the broader goals of the 2020 Agenda. The ongoing reform of the global financial architecture is essential to ensure stability and equity in the international economic system. Zimbabwe fully supports the realization of the SDG stimulus and is looking forward to progress in this endeavor. Zimbabwe concurs with the Secretary General on the urgent need to address the liquidity crisis within the United Nations. We urge all member states to work towards paying their assessed contributions on time and without conditionalities in order to not to disrupt the functioning of our organization. Finally, the forthcoming summit of the future presents a unique opportunity to envision a more resilient, equitable global order. In conclusion, I urge fellow member states to heed the Secretary General's call to action and recommit ourselves to the principles of multilateralism, solidarity, and sustainable development. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Zimbabwe, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Senegal.
Thank you, President. In listening to the SG, I thought it was important for me to hail the clarity and the foresight of these priorities, which are in step with current and future challenges of our world. And I heard his speech about the need to reinvigorate international financial architecture, but also with regard to the processes we see in the world economically, politically, at the United Nations, in the context of security, and with regard to a just and equitable energy transition. But I have two major points, but before that, I want to say that nothing can be done without commitment on the part of all the member states. These priorities were presented on behalf of all the member states, and we need to all show a positive attitude in order to achieve those priorities. And if we only see narrow interests rather than global interests, then we won't be able to move forward. So I want to call for a true collective commitment to deliver on these priorities. So I have two points that I wanted to stress. The first point is multilateralism, which is in a sort of malaise. We're in a world that is ill. And there are a number of things going on that are an affront to our conscience. I'm thinking in particular of the situation in Gaza. Today, we have over 27,000 dead, and we haven't seen any positive changes. It's thus urgent for the three dimensions of the solution that they be implemented immediately. We need an immediate ceasefire. And on the humanitarian front, we need humanitarian access. We need to allow UNRWA to function as well. There was an announced suspension of aid to UNRWA. That means that those that have stopped funding are complicit in the massacre of these civilians. The third point here is the two-state solution, which is absolutely vital. Until this solution is accepted, until this process is embarked on by all stakeholders, nothing will move forward. And we'll continue to have attacks. And all of this will continue. But I want to speak about Africa. I want to talk about the vulnerability in Africa. This is vulnerability with regard to food, energy, inter alia. And I want to here invite everyone to engage in a sort of subsidiarity here. I think before committing to globalized solutions, I think above all, we could look at other initiatives. I could give you a lot of examples of this, but the time doesn't allow me to delve into the details, so I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Senegal, and I now invite the distinguished representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia.
Muchas gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. We'd like to thank and we support the Secretary General for presenting his priorities for 2024. Bolivia endorsed G77 and China and Botswana on behalf of the landlocked developing countries. Given the multidimensional crisis that the world is facing, we feel it's fundamental that we concentrate our efforts on building peace in all its dimensions, peace with social justice. Geopolitical conflicts and wars are only leading to greater suffering of the most vulnerable civilian populations. In order to honor the principles of the Charter and multilateralism, what we need is greater coherence between what we say and what we do. We cannot continue to assign more and more money to war and weapons when thousands and thousands of people are suffering hunger throughout the planet. President, we stress the emphasis put by the Secretary General on the need also to build peace with nature, with Mother Earth. We are facing a clear worsening deterioration of the environment, and the actions that have been taken are insufficient. Developed countries must meet their financing commitments in accordance with the Paris Agreement and the agreements at COP28 and previous COPs. Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals should continue to be the main priority for our organization, and the new processes, such as the Summit for the Future, must make it possible for us to strengthen their implementation and move even beyond that. If we continue at the speed that we're at now, it won't be possible to achieve those goals, particularly for developing countries. And in that regard, the restructuring of the international financial system is indispensable and an urgent matter, as the Secretary General quite rightly pointed out in his report. Finally, we very much appreciate the advisory group on artificial intelligence that's been established by the Secretary General. That technology needs to be an instrument to strengthen education and health and comprehensive development. And in that regard, the Digital Compact should make it possible to make technology more democratic. And in that regard, we hope that the results of the advisory working group will be shared and debated as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. The delegation of Ukraine welcomes the briefing of the Secretary General on his priorities for 2024, and we align ourselves with a statement delivered by the delegation of the European Union and would like to add some following points in our national capacity. As the world faces increasingly complex challenges, poverty, hunger, escalating climate emergency, armed conflicts, the poorest and most vulnerable people are hit hardest. Under these extremely challenging conditions, we commend the Secretary General's efforts to promote economic growth and advance sustainable development goals, protect human rights, justice and international law, mitigate global food insecurity and its humanitarian impact. We need to work together to invest in renewable energy, universal social protection, quality education, decent job creation, universal health coverage, sustainable food systems, infrastructure, and the digital transformation. Mr. Secretary General, we commend your call for a just and sustainable peace in Ukraine, in line with the Charter and the international law. In order to achieve common joint priorities, we need an effective, efficient, and accountable UN system with due respect to the UN Charter purposes and principles. But it's absolutely clear that all our joint efforts aimed at implementing your priorities won't be successful while a country occupying the permanent seat in the UN Security Council brazenly ruins the UN system. Given the magnitude and severity of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, there is an indisputable imperative for accountability. Therefore, it's crucial to uphold comprehensive and ongoing monitoring and reporting by all relevant UN mandates. We count on impartial and credible monitoring and reporting on the human rights situation in Ukraine, encompassing all its temporarily occupied territories, as well as within the mandates of the UN Security Council regarding children in armed conflicts and conflict-related sexual violence. We wish to remind that restoring respect to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter is paramount for ensuring international peace and security and serves as a critical prerequisite for progress in addressing key global challenges. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Côte d'Ivoire to take the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Côte d'Ivoire endorses the statement delivered on behalf of the African group and on behalf of the G77 and China. My delegation is pleased to be participating in this important meeting devoted to the presentation of the Secretary General's annual report on the activities of the United Nations and its prospects for the year 2024. We thank Mr. António Guterres for his outstanding briefing, and we take advantage of this opportunity to pay a stirring tribute to him for his able stewardship in the implementation of the fundamental goals of our organization, and we reiterate our full support to him. President, given the multiple interconnected challenges, my country calls for unwavering efforts, initiatives, and priorities defined by the Secretary General to arrive at sustainable solutions to stem the adverse effects of various crises, which are increasing the fragility of our world. My delegation believes that it's necessary to scale up our ambitions to forge a world that's more resilient and prosperous in this challenging international context. In that regard, my country reaffirms its commitment to multilateralism grounded in the purposes and principles of the Charter of our common organizations, to multilateralism that is more inclusive and efficient to leave no one behind. In that regard, we echo the numerous advocates calling for bold reform of the economic and financial global governance, which provides permanent solutions to the problems of financing for development with an eye to accelerating the implementation of the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development and the 2063 Action Plan of the African Union. Côte d'Ivoire reiterates as well its call for more attention to be paid to the promotion of innovative financing, to the issue of debt, to combating illicit financial flows, to special drawing rights, as well as to the mobilization of national resources and investments, massive investments in the green transition. In closing, my delegation hopes that the Summit of the Future of September 2024 and the Global Social Summit of 2025 will provide an opportunity to take a decisive step to craft societies that are more resilient, inclusive, prosperous, and that have greater respect for the environment. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Côte d'Ivoire, and I now invite the observer of the Observer State of the Holy See to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, for allowing our delegation to join the voice of many colleagues to express our deep gratitude to the Secretary General for his presentation today of the priorities, but also for his leadership during this mandate with ordinary and extraordinary measures to implement what he put at the top of the agenda, the pursuit of peace, raison d'être of these organizations. And in this context, I would like to remind a motto that the champion of peace, the late John Paul II, once stated: there is no peace without justice, but there is no justice without forgiveness. And we understand very well what justice means. The presentation today has told us the different aspects, social, political, economical, financial, environmental, digital, of justice. But there is also another aspect which concern the processes of deep reconciliations. And we have seen there is no lasting peace if there is no a deep reconciliation based on forgiveness and understanding. And I'm glad to say that in a few days distance from the United Nations International Day of Human Fraternity, which I have just celebrated with other colleagues, who took inspiration from the document signed by Pope Francis and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar at Tayyib for war, peace, and living together. We express our commitment to continue to contribute in this room and on the ground for all processes of deep, profound, and sincere reconciliation towards peace. Thank you very much.
I thank the observer of the observer state of the Holy See. I now invite the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency António Guterres, to provide his observations on the interventions made by delegations. Secretary General.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you very much to all delegations for the extremely rich contributions for the debate and for the perspectives with which we can build a common future. We are facing a paradox. When an entity faces existential challenges, that entity should be united. Unfortunately, we are facing existential challenges and we are divided. In the 20th century, there was essentially one existential challenge, the risk of a nuclear war. And the world was divided, namely divided into two blocks in the second half of the century. But after some incidents in which it was clear that the risk was serious, there was the wisdom of the leaders of the two blocks to understand that it was necessary to put some order into the question. And we had efforts of arms control, of disarmament, of a set of rules in order to avoid that the existential threat would become a disaster for humankind. Now in the 21st century, we have three existential threats. We still have the existential threat of the nuclear threat, and we have climate change, and we have now the potential risks of the development of artificial intelligence. And in these circumstances, the drama is that we are not sufficiently united, or at least sufficiently organized to be able to respond effectively to any of these three existential challenges. And on top of that, we see a multiplication of conflicts in a context not only of exacerbation of local problems, but also of the impact on those local problems of the geopolitical divides. Why is it happening so? Allow me some, I would say, a bit philosophical reflection. I think we are witnessing at the present moment in the different cycles that life in the world has, some short-term cycles, some medium-term cycles, some more long-term cycles. Looking into the cycles I lived, a medium-term cycle and a long-term cycle, I feel that we are in both of them in the coincidence of a low point, what makes the solution of problems particularly difficult. The first cycle I lived was the cycle that after the Second World War started with the bipolar world. To it followed a unipolar world in the end of the 20th century. And now we are struggling to move into a multipolar world, but in a way that is not yet clear, in a way that tends to be chaotic, and in which power relations are not clear. And when power relations are not clear, there is a tendency for many to feel that they can do whatever they want because they know that there is total impunity and they won't pay a price for it. And we see many of the crises that are multiplying in different parts of the world linked to this kind of impunity. But on the other hand, I think we are still living in the low point of a much longer cycle, that is the cycle corresponding to the legacy of the way expansionist and colonial empires ended. If one looks at many of the crises that we have today, we see roots that go to that legacy. I mean, it's impossible when we see the Russian invasion of Ukraine not to think about the Russian Empire and the different discussions within the Russian Empire of the concepts of nationality and the way the Russian Empire ended after with the Soviet Union and its end. When one looks at the problems we still face in the Balkans, it's difficult not to think about the end of the Ottoman Empire and the rival competition between the Russian Empire and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and its consequences in the way they ended. When one looks at the Middle East, difficult not to think about the end of the Ottoman Empire and then the British and the French mandates and the way all of these has ended and the problems, the unresolved problems that we have received from that period. In South Asia, difficult not to see the consequences of the way the British Empire ended. And in Africa, it is clear also many of those consequences. I can speak for my own country, for Portugal. We were the last colonial empire because of the policies absolutely, I mean, outdated and unacceptable of our dictatorship. But the truth is that after independence, the situations created led to a civil war in Angola and a civil war in Mozambique. And so we are, to a certain extent, in a moment in which these two low levels of the cycle, power relations that are unclear, and unresolved problems coming from the end of the empires, combinating in a way that multiplies crises and make crises much more difficult to solve. Because in many of these crises difficult to solve, there is a difficult understanding about the past. There are different interpretations about the past, not only in a matter of opinion, but in a matter even of the way facts are described. And my experience of life, and not only in politics, but also in human life, in many aspects, family questions, and it's always very difficult to agree about the past. And so my first appeal is, let's try to concentrate efforts in addressing the crisis we have today, being able to promote, and the distinguished observer of the OLC spoke about reconciliation, being able to promote a reconciliation that probably will never come from an agreement about what the past was, but needs to come from an agreement about what the future should be. And at the same time, when things are so complex as they are today, we need to have a set of principles, because without that set of principles, we will not be able to solve anything. First aspect of this set of principles, it's absolutely essential to respect the UN Charter. It's absolutely essential to respect international law. It's absolutely essential to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries. It's absolutely essential to respect international humanitarian law and the laws of war, the Geneva Conventions. Second, that I believe is also important, there is no peace without justice. If we really want to have peace and sustainable peace, we need to address the very dramatic inequalities that exist in today's world, and we need to find solutions for that. And finally, it is clear that the multilateral governance mechanisms that we have today are indeed outdated, are indeed unfair, and are indeed ineffective. They are not even comprehensive in relation to the totality of new problems and challenges that we face. And there must be a serious effort of reform in order to make sure that we are able to build together a multilateral system that is more inclusive, more equitable, but also more comprehensive and effective in addressing the challenges of our time. But one thing is clear. We are in trouble. We need to get out of this trouble, and peace is the central objective that we must pursue together.
I thank the Secretary General for his statement and indeed for ending on the note that he ended, that peace must be the central objective. The 54th plenary meeting of the General Assembly is now resumed. The General Assembly will continue its consideration of Agenda Item 110, entitled Report of the Secretary General on the Work of the Organization. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Guatemala, speaking on behalf of the group of friends of the responsibility to protect.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor of delivering this statement on behalf of the group of friends of the responsibility to protect, consisting of 55 member states and the European Union, and this year co-chaired by Croatia, Morocco, and my country, Guatemala. We thank the Secretary General for his report on the work of the organization and briefing of his priorities for 2024. We were pleased to see that prevention and addressing the risks of atrocity crimes are recognized under key objectives in the report. We remain strongly committed to combating impunity and promoting justice and accountability, as these are key components of the responsibility to protect. To this end, in 2023, the group of friends participated in various debates in the Security Council during the special meeting of ECOSOC on social and economic measures to prevent genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, and at the annual debate on the responsibility to protect in the General Assembly. We firmly believe that atrocity prevention and the effective implementation of the responsibility to protect agenda contributes to fulfilling the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda, as well as the new agenda for peace. In this context, the United Nations have an important role to play in conflict and atrocity prevention and the peaceful settlement of disputes, including by using preventive diplomacy, fact-finding, and reporting, and the provision of good offices, mediation, and dialogue facilitation in response to risks of conflicts and atrocity crimes. The Secretary General's annual thematic reports on R2P have been incredibly important to broadening our collective understanding of R2P. The international community would benefit from receiving from the United Nations information on current trends of risks of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing and their prevention. It is for this reason that the group of friends of R2P and some additional member states have called for the inclusion of such information in future reports of the Secretary General, as well as recommendations for responses on national, regional, and global levels. We also encourage the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide and the Special Advisor on the Responsibility to Protect, once appointed, to continue to raise situations where there are risks of atrocities through their joint public statements. Furthermore, the group of friends would like to reiterate its call to consider follow-up on the implementation of recommendations contained in previous reports more regularly and systematically, and possibly in the form of an annex to the yearly reports. We strongly believe that this will strengthen the reports and enhance the protection of vulnerable populations at risk of atrocity crimes. Lastly, we reiterate that it is critical that the UN Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect is able to operate at full strength with the conceptual and practical guidance of a special advisor on the responsibility to protect. Therefore, we look forward to the appointment of a new special advisor on R2P as soon as possible. In the same vein, the group highlights the need to ensure that existing resources, particularly appropriate allocation of funds related to administrative support, travel, and staffing, are dedicated to the new special advisor on the responsibility to protect. The group of friends looks forward to working closely with the next special advisor on the responsibility to protect, with expectations that they will be able to perform their mandates with ease and appropriate professional support that will enable a longer tenure than that of their predecessors. The group of friends also looks forward to continuing to engage with and to support the work of the United Nations Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Guatemala, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil, speaking on behalf of the Peacebuilding Commission.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am speaking on behalf of the Peacebuilding Commission. Mr. President, let me thank, through you, the Secretary General for presenting his report on the work of the organization and his priorities for 2024. The report of the Secretary General contains references to the work of the Commission and underlines the broadening of its geographical scope and inclusion. In this regard, in 2023, it may be noted that meetings were held on Canada, Honduras, Nepal, Norway, and Mozambique at their request, and the Commission also engaged in support of country and region-specific settings. The Commission has also made efforts to improve timeliness and focus of its advice to the Security Council. It also gave advice to the General Assembly and had submissions and briefings to ECOSOC and its meetings, focusing on thematic, country, and regional issues. The Commission also engaged with a wide range of UN humanitarian, development, and peace actors, especially peacekeeping operations, special political missions, as well as UN country teams. The PBC also strengthened its ties with regional organizations, in particular the African Union. To strengthen the universality of peacebuilding and broaden its scope and themes, the Commission engaged both with developed and developing countries to discuss, among other, transitional justice, development challenges, and indigenous issues. The Commission also advocated for sustainable and predictable financing. The adoption of the General Assembly Resolution A-Res 78/257, investing in prevention and peace building, is a positive outcome whose provisions should be fully implemented with closer coordination between the PBC and the PBF. It aims at strengthening the work of the organization on peace building throughout the entire peace continuum. We congratulate the chair of the Fifth Committee, the permanent representative of Egypt, and all member states for their tireless efforts to reach agreement on this important issue. All this work testifies to the increasing relevance of the PBC in the peacebuilding architecture of the United Nations and the importance member states accord to the Commission. We hope we will continue to work on further strengthening of the Commission's role in peace building and sustaining peace, improving its advisory, bridging and convening role, and strengthening ties with regional organizations and international and regional financial institutions. For this to happen, we also need stronger ties between the Commission and the Peacebuilding Fund. We look forward to further discussing the role of the Commission in the context of the 2025 review of the peacebuilding architecture. I thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Brazil, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Costa Rica to take the floor.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, we would like to endorse the statement delivered by Guatemala on the group of friends of R2P. The Secretary General's report presents us with a sad but realistic picture of our international community, which should encourage us to adopt collective and altruistic measures for the good of our planet. The climate emergency, armed conflicts, food insecurity, poverty, inequality, and the lack of trust and hope are complex and interrelated crises that are simply unsustainable. The unique position of the United Nations allows us to think according to the conviction that if we care about the most vulnerable and marginalized, we, the peoples of the United Nations, must then expeditiously address their needs and the systemic problems that created these cases of suffering, anguish, and fear. As the Secretary General indicated, global crises are unfairly assailing the most vulnerable and marginalized. Women, girls, boys, minorities, indigenous communities, and the peoples of the global south are just some of those who always pay the highest price of crises, despite having had no role in triggering them. The survival and well-being of people can no longer depend on the geographical location or the wealth of a state, as we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic. The systemic issues behind inequalities and injustice must be addressed collectively. The triple planetary crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic have shown us more than ever before that human security can only be collective, and necessarily it must be driven by equity. In particular, the effects of such crises on women and girls are often overshadowed or ignored. But it is reassuring that, according to reports, the organization is paying specific attention to their rights. Every child must be guaranteed the conditions to smile and be free to dream. The United Nations must also continue to invest efforts and resources in order to shed light on crises and needs that fall outside of geopolitical priorities or momentary dynamics in order to leave no one behind. Similarly, international and non-international armed conflicts and armed violence connect the suffering of people and communities in one part of the planet with aspects of the lives of other people in other parts of the world. If we truly believe in community well-being, collective security, and the universal enjoyment of human rights, all this must end. Unfortunately, armed conflicts remain a reality, and the principles and norms of relevant international law, especially humanitarian and human rights law, which used to be considered written in stone, are being challenged by the daily actions or the acquiescence of various actors around the world. the protection of civilians and other protected persons, the moderation of military operations, and the prohibition of indiscriminate means and methods of warfare must remain central elements of the organization's practical and political efforts. Therefore, we are comforted to see the centrality of international law in the Secretary-General's efforts to promote and maintain peace. Respect for international standards saves lives, prevents harm, and builds trust from the local to the global level. The UN has a vital role in guaranteeing respect for and the application of all norms of international law beyond the contingencies of the moment. It is also comforting to note that this organization has never stopped preventing conflicts and promoting and maintaining the cessation of armed violence and positive peace. Such prevention silences the weapons, but also prevents the harmful effects of conflict and armed violence that last long beyond the end of active hostilities. Trauma, fear, damage to essential infrastructure, the proliferation of small arms and light weapons and their ammunition, contamination with explosive remnants resulting from conflict and armed violence, freeze development and hinder the full enjoyment of human rights for peoples and communities. As stated in a new agenda for peace, we must all reduce the human cost of weapons. Humanitarian efforts, disarmament must always be looked at in terms of their long-term effects on the lives of people and the international system, which is there to protect the most vulnerable and marginalized. Allow me to also recall that any process from discussion in international fora, the assessment of needs and the development of strategies to the implementation of operations must significantly include women and children and young people, as well as those that are marginalized. And historically, that's been communities and all of those directly affected by current crises. Often, it's on the basis of the lived experience of all of these people that we are able to appreciate how we can improve this international community. And it's also essential to stress the importance that the United Nations work together with civil society organizations at all levels, which often have essential knowledge and experience that can complement and contextualize United Nations efforts. Now, more than ever, we need collective and inclusive actions to address global challenges. While there is always room for improvement, the Secretary-General's report shows significant steps driven by genuine goodwill and informed by the founding principles of the Charter. Peace and human security for all must remain our fundamental priorities. Our compass to navigate the current turbulent waters in order to remain loyal to our collective principles and standards and work towards a better future. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Costa Rica for his statement, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Mr. President, we thank the Secretary General for his priorities and annual report. We share the concern of the ever-growing distrust and fragmentation in global affairs. Respect towards UN Charter and international law continues to erode, as we are witnessing in Gaza. Our failures to act decisively will only bring us closer to the final nail of the coffin of the UN. Trust and cooperation with the spirit of partnership and solidarity must be revived. We echo the call to restore trust by upholding respect for the rule of law, acting on our political commitments to reform and strengthen multilateralism, and to ensure the UN is more effective, transparent, accountable, and representative. The upcoming Summit of the Future presents us with a golden opportunity to transform the multilateral system to fit for purpose. We must have a high ambition to transform not only the multilateral institution, but also our working methods and ethics. We agree with the Secretary General this morning that all actions must lead to peace and development. We must therefore give adequate attention and resources to addressing conflicts in Gaza, Myanmar, and other parts of the world. With 6 years left to achieving the SDGs, we are in a litmus test to safeguard the best interests of present and future generations. Rest assured, Mr. President, of Indonesia's constructive engagement throughout the process in rebuilding trust, restoring hope, and reforming the UN to achieve the promise of the Charter. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Armenia to take the floor.
Mr. President, we thank the Secretary General for presenting the report on the work of the organization and highlighting the priorities for 2024. Armenia notes the reflections on the diverse and evolving threats and challenges affecting the maintenance of international peace, development, and human rights, as well as on the ability of the United Nations to respond to the multitude of issues it had been facing. As ever, the resilience and efficiency of the organization continue to be put to the test, in particular in situations of conflict and crisis. Timely and coherent action to mobilize and deliver adequate humanitarian response to the people in need remain a major challenge, as do the mechanisms for conflict prevention and resolution. Mr. President, while acknowledging the remarkable service and contribution of the UN personnel in protecting human life, human rights, and human dignity in various parts of the world, we are compelled to note with deep concern that time and again the organization has not been able to deliver protection to vulnerable communities facing existential threats. The blockade and starvation of the population of Nagorno-Karabakh, with the barbaric siege of its only transportation lifeline, which started in December 2022 and culminated in September 2023 with the use of deadly military action against innocent civilian population, is one explicit example of premeditated ethnic cleansing which was gradually perpetrated under the watch of the international community. It has resulted in widespread forced displacement of the entire ethnic Armenian population, immense sufferings caused to the civilians, and indeed a most brazen and blatant violation of international law, including the very charter of this organization. Despite a multitude of clearly detectable early warning signs and calls for intervention, the United Nations fell short of addressing the egregious violations committed in Nagorno-Karabakh. Not only does this failure constitute a breach of the fundamental principles upon which this very organization was established, but it also signifies, in no uncertain terms, a major departure from the internationally endorsed commitment of the responsibility to protect populations from atrocity crimes, including genocides and ethnic cleansings. As we address the annual report of the UN Secretary General, we trust that moving forward, the organization will acknowledge the gravity of these violations and reflect on its failure to prevent them. Mr. President, the report refers to the promotion of justice and settlement of disputes, notably through the work of the International Court of Justice and its rulings, including through the indication of provisional measures. It should be recalled that in the period from 2021 to 2023, the International Court of Justice issued 8 provisional measures, 8, against Azerbaijan, including the legally binding obligation to ensure unimpeded movement of persons, vehicles, and cargo along the Lachin corridor in both directions, as well as the obligation to ensure that persons who have forced out of Nagorno-Karabakh after 19 September 2023 are able to return in a safe and unimpeded manner. Compliance with the decisions of the ICJ is fundamental in ensuring that justice can be served and that breaches to international law can be essentially prevented in the future, whereas failure to do so only serves the interests of those who seek to undermine the viability of international law and to challenge the integrity and credibility of international legal system. The United Nations, through its respective actions and mandates, has a distinct responsibility to ensure that rule of law prevails over violence and aggression, and that justice and accountability remain essential in guiding the work of the organization. Armenia is committed to promoting accountability and fighting impunity as demonstrated by our recent accession to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, effective since 1st February 2024. Mr. President, as ever, Armenia remains steadfast in supporting efforts for strengthening the efficiency of the organization, its resilience and integrity in the face of current and evolving challenges. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Armenia for his statement. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item for this morning. We shall hear the no remaining speaker. We shall hear the remaining speakers at 3 p.m. this afternoon in this hall, after the consideration of the other items announced in the United Nations Journal. The meeting is adjourned.